Welcome to Learning Anatomy with Dr. Bakari. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the innervations of the nasal cavity. I have done a part 1 lecture on the nasal cavity where I discussed about the anatomy of the nasal cavity, and also a part 2 lecture where I discussed about the blood supply of the nasal cavity. Please go and check those lectures out to keep yourself updated. But for the purpose of this class, we would be focusing on just the innervations of the nasal cavity. So write down with me as I unfold the different branches that are seen to innervate the nasal cavity. The innervations of the nasal cavity is divided into 2 subclasses. We have the special sensory innervation and we have the general sensory innervation. The special sensory innervation of the nasal cavity is a special type of innervation that detects the sense of smell, and this is carried by the olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve. For the general sensory innervation, which has to deal with the sense of touch, the sense of pain, the sense of change in temperature. This general sensory type of innervation is carried by 2 nerves, and these are the trigeminal nerve, which is the 5th cranial nerve, and also the Pterygopalatine ganglion. So we have these 2 structures providing the general sensory innervations of the nasal cavity, while the special sensory innervation, which is for the sense of smell, is carried by the olfactory nerve. Then going back to the general sensory innervation, we know that the trigeminal nerve has 3 subdivisions. We have the ophthalmic nerve, which is the first branch of the trigeminal nerve, and we have the second branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is the maxillary nerve, and the last branch of the trigeminal nerve is the mandibular nerve. So all these branches are the 3 sub-branches of the trigeminal nerve, and these 3 branches are not all involved in the innervation of the nasal cavity. It is just the ophthalmic and the maxillary nerve that are involved in providing branches that are seen to innervate the nasal cavity. This we would see as we go through with this lecture. Just for us to know, in case we are asked during examination, that the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve is not involved in innervating the nasal cavity. The only branches that are seen to innervate the nasal cavity are branches from both the ophthalmic and the maxillary nerve. So we should note this, that it is just the ophthalmic and the maxillary nerve that provide the innervation of the nasal cavity, while the mandibular nerve is not involved in innervating the nasal cavity. Also, we have the Pterygopalatine ganglion. This Palatine ganglion also provide general sensory innervation of the nasal cavity. It also has a number of branches, but it is the nasal and the palatine branches of the Pterygopalatine ganglion that are seen to innervate the nasal cavity. As we also go through with this lecture, we'll be seeing the different branches of the Pterygopalatine ganglion, and we'll be seeing the branches that are involved in innervating the nasal cavity. So let's go through with this lecture to see how branches from each of the highlighted nerves are seen to provide innervations for the nasal cavity. But going through first the special sensory innervation, we already said that the special sensory innervation is carried by the olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve, and this is solely responsible for the sense of smell because this is a special sensory innervation. So for the specific action in detecting the sense of smell in the nasal cavity is carried solely by the olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve, and this is where the structure is located at the roof or the apex of the nasal cavity. This is the configuration of the nasal cavity here. You see that the olfactory gadget is located at the roof or the apex of the nasal cavity, and this is what is projected in this image. And if you look at this structure, you see that we have the olfactory epithelium. These are the olfactory epithelium here, highlighted in green, and this is what is harrowed here in blue. So you have the olfactory epithelium. We already described this also in our previous lecture on the nasal cavity. The olfactory epithelium are specialized type of epithelium that has seen to be restricted or limited to just the roof or the apex of the nasal cavity, and this is where we have the olfactory segment of the nasal cavity. So for the olfactory segment that is located around the apex of the nasal cavity, we have specialized type of epithelium that is seen to be lining this specific region, and this is what we call the olfactory epithelium, and this is what is highlighted here in green. You can see one of the cell here, arrowed here in blue. So within this olfactory epithelium, we have the olfactory receptors, which are sensory receptors that are able to detect the sense of smell. So we have the olfactory receptors here, arrowed in white. These are the olfactory receptors that are embedded within the olfactory epithelium. So you have axon emerging from the olfactory receptors, and these are the axons here, highlighted in red and also arrowed in black. So this axon is what is referred to as the olfactory nerve. But the olfactory nerve, we know that it emerges is within the apex or the roof of the nasal cavity. And this nerve needs to pass through this region for it to enter into the cranial cavity where we have the olfactory cortex. And that is why we have the collection of these bundles passing through the perforation that is created on the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. We also described the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone in our previous part 1 lecture on the nasal cavity. We said that this cribriform plate, this is where it is located here, that is arrowed in purple. This cribriform plate has perforations or foramina on it through which the axons of the olfactory nerve will pass through so as for it to be able to enter into the cranial cavity. So it actually passes through these foramina that are created on the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone, and that is when the olfactory nerve will then have access into the cranial cavity. And the first structure that it will be terminating on is the olfactory bulb, and this is what is arrowed here in yellow. This is the olfactory bulb here, highlighted in green. This is like a relay station. So this is where the axon of the olfactory nerve coming from the apex of the nasal cavity, after passing through the cribriform foramina, will be relayed onto. And from here, we then have the olfactory tract that is arrowed here in red. So this is the olfactory tract. This is the tract that will now be taking special sensory information to the olfactory cortex. And this is where the interpretation of these impulses will be done. So this is how the special sensory innervation of the nasal cavity is generated. And you can see that it is the olfactory nerve that is responsible for the transmission of these impulses. Then going to the general sensory innervation. The general sensory innervation of the nasal cavity is designed to carry the sense of touch, the sense of pain, and also the change in temperature. So this general sensory information will be taken up by the general sensory nerve of the nasal cavity. And we've highlighted in our previous slide that the trigeminal nerve and also the Pterygopalatine ganglion are responsible for providing the general sensory innervation of the nasal cavity. So we have this general sensory innervation. As we'll be going through with this slide, we are going to be discussing side by side the lateral wall of the nasal cavity and also the nasal septum. So when we try to describe a particular nerve, we will be describing the branches of this nerve that will be supplying the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and also the branches of the same nerve that will also be supplying the nasal septum. So we are going to be taking the lateral wall of the nasal cavity and the nasal septum side by side as we go through with this lecture. So the general sensory innervation, we already established from our previous slide that it is carried by branches of the trigeminal nerve, which is the 5th cranial nerve. But it is not all the branches of the trigeminal nerve that are involved in the general sensory innervation of the nasal cavity. It is just the ophthalmic nerve and also the maxillary nerve, which is the 1st and the 2nd sub-branches of the trigeminal nerve. The mandibular nerve is not involved in innervating the nasal cavity, just for us to know. Then the second branch that will be providing sensory innervation is the Pterygopalatine ganglion. We also said that the Pterygopalatine ganglion has a number of branches, but the branches that are involved in innervating the nasal cavity are just limited to the nasal branches and the palatine branches. We'll also be getting to this point during the course of this lecture. So just follow suit and see how these branches innervate the different regions of the nasal cavity. So driving in on the general sensory innervation, we already talked about the trigeminal nerve, and we said that in the trigeminal nerve, we have the ophthalmic and the maxillary nerve giving off branches to supply the nasal cavity. So we'll first be looking into the ophthalmic nerve. We know that the ophthalmic nerve is the 1st branch of the trigeminal nerve. So we have the ganglion of the trigeminal nerve here, arrowed in blue. It has 3 subdivisions, and this is the ophthalmic nerve. So the ophthalmic nerve here is arrowed in yellow. This is the 1st branch of the trigeminal nerve that is arrowed in blue. So as this branch is giving off, it passed through the superior orbital feature. The superior orbital feature is at the posterior part of the orbit, and it is through that feature that is able to access the orbit. You now see the ophthalmic nerve within the orbit. So within the orbit, it gives off the nasociliary nerve. The nasociliary nerve, I've always said on this channel that all we need to do is to break down the name. This is the nasociliary nerve here that is arrowed in blue, which means that this nerve will be having nasal branches and will also be having ciliary branches. So it will be having the branches that will be directed towards the nasal region, and also branches that will also be directed towards the eye region. That's what that simply means. So this is the nasociliary nerve here that is located within the orbit. Of course, a sub-branch of the ophthalmic nerve, because this is the ophthalmic nerve. We know the ophthalmic nerve is a branch from the trigeminal nerve. It's actually the first branch of the trigeminal nerve. So we have the nasociliary nerve, expecting it to have nasal branches and also ciliary branches. So we have the nasal branches here arrowed in green, and we also have the ciliary branches here arrowed in green. So we have these two branches. Just by mere breaking down the name, focus will be driven towards the nasal branches because this lecture is on the innervations of the nasal cavity. So going further on the nasal branches here that is arrowed in green, we see that the nasal branches will then give off the anterior ethmoidal nerve, and this is the anterior ethmoidal nerve, and also a posterior ethmoidal nerve, and this is the posterior ethmoidal nerve. So you have the nasal branches giving off anterior ethmoidal nerve and posterior ethmoidal nerve, giving off also within the orbit. This region is still within the orbit, but this nerve needs to pass through a foramen so as for it to exit the orbit, because it is not actually needed in the orbit, it is needed around the nasal region. So it needs to pass through the foramen, and the foramen that the anterior ethmoidal nerve will pass through is the anterior ethmoidal foramen, and this is the anterior ethmoidal foramen here arrowed in purple. We also have a posterior ethmoidal foramen here where the posterior ethmoidal nerve will also pass through. Because the posterior ethmoidal nerve is not involved in innervating the nasal cavity, it is only responsible for innervating the paranasal sinuses. So we are not concerned with this. Our focus will be on the anterior ethmoidal foramen, through which the anterior ethmoidal nerve will pass through. So you see the anterior ethmoidal nerve here passing through the anterior ethmoidal foramen, and when it passes through this space, the next region where it will be seen is within the anterior cranial fossa. So you see it up here because it's passing through the anterior ethmoidal foramen. The anterior ethmoidal foramen is located at the medial wall of the orbit. So as it pierces through the foramen, it's able to enter into the cranial cavity. And specifically, it will be seen within the anterior cranial fossa. It is not needed also within the anterior cranial fossa. Where it is needed is in the nasal cavity. So it still has a long way to go though. So from the cranial cavity, you see it passing along the lateral wall of the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. So if you look at this image here, this is where we have the cribriform plate here. So you see the nerve passing through the lateral wall of the cribriform plate so as for it to be able to access the foramina that are created on the cribriform plate of ethmoid. And as soon as it's able to access that, it finally enters through that foramen, and you see it within the upper part of the nasal cavity. So that is how it's able to access the nasal cavity, and you see it around this space. So you can see that the anterior ethmoidal nerve being given off within the orbit also find its way to enter into the nasal cavity, but it needs to go up into the anterior cranial fossa before it finally finds its way down into the midline to enter into the upper part of the nasal cavity. You can see how interesting this part is. So within this space is when it then gives off its branches. So let's go to the next slide to see the branches of the anterior ethmoidal nerve. So going further on the anterior ethmoidal nerve, it divides into two branches. We have the internal nasal branch. This is the internal nasal nerve that is arrowed here in blue. And this supplies the anterior upper part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Then it gives off the septal branch, and this is the septal branch here, also arrowed in blue. The septal branch will also innervate the anterior upper part of the nasal septum. You can see that if you try to divide the nasal cavity into four quadrants, you have the anterior upper quadrant, you have the anterior lower quadrant, you have the posterior upper quadrant, and you have the posterior lower quadrant. So if you focus on the anterior upper quadrant, you see that this quadrant, in terms of its lateral wall and also septal region, is innervated by branches of the anterior ethmoidal nerve. So you have the anterior ethmoidal nerve here arrowed in red. You see that it gives off two branches. One of its branches, which is the internal nasal nerve, will supply the lateral wall of the nasal cavity that is located within the anterior superior part of the nasal cavity. And it also gives off the septal branch that will innervate the anterior superior part of the nasal septum. So the anterior superior part, both the lateral wall and the nasal septum, are supplied by branches of the anterior ethmoidal nerve, which of course is a branch of the nasociliary nerve, which branches from the ophthalmic. And we know the ophthalmic is a branch of the trigeminal nerve. So if you try to trace it back, you see that it is the first branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is the ophthalmic, that gives off the nasociliary, which finally gives off the anterior ethmoidal nerve. And this nerve will be seen to supply this specific region, both the lateral wall and also the nasal septum of the anterior superior part of the nasal cavity. So driving more on the internal nasal nerve, this is the internal nasal nerve. This will finally terminate as the external nasal nerve. And this is the external nasal nerve here that is arrowed in green. And this is seen to supply the skin around the nose. So it's a cutaneous branch that the internal nasal nerve finally terminates as, and this is referred to as the external nasal nerve. So in case you are asked during examination, the internal nasal nerve finally terminates to become a cutaneous nerve, which is then referred to as the external nasal nerve. And you see it's supplying the external region of the nose. And this is what is arrowed here in green. So going further on the maxillary nerve, the maxillary nerve, we already said, is the second branch of the trigeminal nerve. This is where we have the trigeminal ganglion. We have the ophthalmic nerve here arrowed in red. And the second branch is the maxillary nerve that is arrowed in blue. We already said that it is just the ophthalmic and the maxillary nerve that gives off branches to supply the nasal cavity. The third branch here is the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. It is not involved in the innervation of the nasal cavity. So going through this lower image, this is where we have the maxillary nerve that is arrowed in blue. This maxillary nerve will pass through the foramen rotundum that is created around the inferior part of the cranium, and this allows for the passage of the maxillary nerve to be able to exit the cranial cavity. So this is what is arrowed here in blue. And when the maxillary nerve is seen around this space, it is seen to give off a number of branches. One of the branches is the infraorbital nerve. This is the infraorbital nerve here that is arrowed in black. This infraorbital nerve is seen to pass along the infraorbital canal. Just as the name implies, the infraorbital nerve is seen within the infraorbital canal, although it's a branch of the maxillary nerve that is arrowed in blue here. So it passed through this canal that is highlighted in red, and within the infraorbital canal is where the infraorbital nerve gives off the anterior superior alveolar nerve. So we have the anterior superior alveoli nerve here arrowed in red. You can see it as an emergence of the infraorbital nerve within the infraorbital canal, and you see it passing through this space, exiting this canal. So you see the anterior superior alveoli nerve now passing through the anterior wall of the maxillary sinus. We have the maxillary bone around this region, and you have the maxillary air sinus around this space too. So the anterior superior alveolar nerve will pass through the anterior wall of the maxillary sinus so as to exit that space, and you see it being directed to supply the superior alveoli process. The superior alveoli process is the upper alveoli process that is seen around the oral cavity. So you see it being directed towards that place, and this is how it goes and innervates the upper teeth. So this is what the anterior superior alveoli nerve is programmed to do, even though it's going to also be giving off branches that will help to supply sub-regions of the nasal cavity. So as it goes towards this part, you now see it making an upward turn. So this is where it makes the upward turn after supplying the superior alveoli process. And at this point, you see it giving off two branches. It gives off a branch to supply the anterior inferior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. And this is where it gives off that branch, is supplying the anterior inferior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and also giving up a septal branch, and this is the septal branch here, where it supplies the anterior inferior part of the nasal septum. So you can see that if you try to divide the nasal cavity into 4 quadrants, you have the anterior quadrant here at the front, and you have the posterior quadrant here behind. In the anterior quadrant, you have the anterior upper quadrant, and you have the anterior lower quadrant. For the anterior upper quadrant, we already stated in our previous slide that it is innervated by branches from the ophthalmic nerve, supplying anterior upper lateral wall and also the anterior upper nasal septum. For the anterior inferior part down here, it is supplied by branches from the maxillary nerve. And that is where we have the anterior superior alveolar nerve emerging from the infraorbital nerve. And this is what supplies both the lateral wall and also the nasal septum around the anterior inferior part. So the next is to highlight the nerve that will be supplying the posterior quadrant, which will include the posterior upper quadrant and also the posterior lower quadrant. Also remember in our previous slide, we already highlighted that the general sensory innervation of the nasal cavity is innervated by branches from the trigeminal nerve and also branches from the pterygopalatine ganglion. And we've tried to establish where branches from the trigeminal nerve, which include the ophthalmic and the maxillary nerve, innervate, which is the anterior quadrant of the nasal cavity, which include the anterior upper and the anterior lower regions, while the posterior quadrant will be innervated by branches from the pterygopalatine ganglion. So let's go further to see the different branches of the pterygopalatine ganglion that will be innervating specifically the posterior regions or the posterior quadrants of the nasal cavity. So going further, the pterygopalatine ganglion is also referred to as the Meckel's ganglion or the Nasal ganglion. It can also be referred to as the sphenopalatine ganglion. This is formed as a collection of cell body of a postganglionic parasympathetic neuron. And you see it located within the pterygopalatine fossa or the sphenopalatine fossa. And the pterygopalatine fossa can also be referred to as the sphenopalatine fossa because the sphenoid bone is seen to project food processes that are referred to as pterygoid plates. So you can replace the pterygoid with spheno because it's still within the configuration of the sphenoid bone. So this is where the pterygopalatine ganglion is located in red, and it is located within the pterygopalatine fossa or the sphenopalatine fossa. This structure is a collection of cell bodies, and that is why you see it as a swelling. We already described the configuration of the neuron. If you've not checked out my lecture on the neuron, please kindly go and do so. And we know that collection of cell body outside the central nervous system is referred to as ganglion, and when they are located within the central nervous system, they are referred to as nuclei. So because they are located outside the central nervous system and their collection of cell body, they are referred to as ganglion. This ganglion here is located within the pterygopalatine fossa, and you see it located inferior to the maxillary nerve. We already described this maxillary nerve in our previous slide where we tried to describe the branches that supply the anterior inferior part of the nasal cavity, both the lateral wall and also the nasal septum. This is the maxillary nerve here harrowed in black. This maxillary nerve is connected to the pterygopalatine ganglion through short ganglionic branches. These ganglionic branches are seen to help suspend the pterygopalatine ganglion, just like helping to hold it in place. So you see it being held in place or connected to the maxillary nerve up here. Then you see this ganglion giving off a number of branches. We said this during the beginning of this lecture, that the pterygopalatine ganglion is seen to give off a number of branches. And one of those branches is the orbital branches. So we have the orbital branches just from the name here highlighted in yellow going towards the region of the orbit. So it's going to be supplying structures around that area. Then we have the nasal branches, and this is the nasal branches here highlighted in red going towards the nasal cavity, where it will be supplying structures located also around that space. Then we have the palatine branches. These are the palatine branches here highlighted in purple. This is directed towards the palate, and of course we'll be supplying structures around that region. So majorly the palatine branches is seen to contain both the lesser and the greater palatine nerves. So it's good for us to take note of this. Then we also have the pharyngeal branches, and these are the pharyngeal branches here highlighted in green going towards the pharynx or innervating structures around that region. So you see that it has a number of branches, but out of these branches, It is just the nasal branches and also the palatine branches that will be giving supply to innervate the posterior region of the nasal cavity. So that is what we're left with. So if you try to divide the nasal cavity into the quadrants that it is made up of, you see that the anterior quadrant, we've established in our previous slide that the anterior upper quadrant is innervated by branches from the ophthalmic, which is the first branch of the trigeminal, while the anterior lower quadrant is innervated by branches from the maxillary nerve, which is the second branch of the trigeminal nerve. So the region that we are left with is the posterior quadrant, which include the posterior upper and the posterior lower. So let's go further to see how these branches emerge to innervate the posterior region of the nasal cavity. So going further, talking about the branches, we have the nasal branches. These are the nasal branches here highlighted in red, and we also have the palatine branches here highlighted in purple. We already said that these two branches will be giving off branches to innervate the posterior region of the nasal cavity. So this gives off their branches, and you see them passing through the posterolateral wall of the nasal cavity. So that is where they pass through to enter into the nasal cavity from behind, while some of them will pass through the sphenopalatine foramen. We already described the sphenopalatine foramen in our previous part 1 lecture on the nasal cavity. But as we go through, we see the different nerves that pass through the different sub-regions to access the nasal cavity. Let's first divide the nasal cavity into the quadrant that it is made up of. We have the anterior quadrant, which we've highlighted the nerves that are responsible for innervating this region. So for the posterior quadrant, which is further subdivided into the posterior upper quadrant and the posterior lower quadrant. So let's see the branches that would emerge to supply or innervate these sub-regions. First region, talking about the posterior upper quadrant, we have the emergence of the posterior superior lateral nasal nerve. This is the posterior superior lateral nasal nerve. From the name, it is posterior because it's supplying the posterior region of the nasal cavity, and superior because it's supplying the posterior superior part of the nasal cavity. And it's lateral because it's supplying the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So this is what you can use to establish the specific region that this nerve is innervating. So the posterior superior lateral nasal nerve, this is what is highlighted here in red. You see it emerging from the nasal branches. So as it emerges, you see it supplying the posterior superior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Remember, we said I will be taking the lateral wall and also the nasal septum side by side. So this is what gives supply to innervate the posterior superior lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Then the second branch is the posterior inferior lateral wall, still on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. This is not an emergence of the nasal branches. This emerges from the palatine branches. Remember, we talked about the palatine branches. We said we have the greater and the lesser palatine nerve. So from the greater palatine nerve, we have the emergence of the posterior inferior lateral nasal nerve. And this nerve is seen to innervate the posterior inferior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Just mere looking at the name, you can detect the specific region of the nasal cavity where it innervates. It is the posterior inferior part of the nasal cavity. And where it specifically innervates in terms of the specific regions of the nasal cavity is the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. And that's why it has lateral in its name. So you have the posterior inferior lateral nasal nerve supplying the posterior inferior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, just as the name implies. But it's good for us to know that the posterior inferior lateral nasal nerve is not a nasal branch. It is from the greater palatine nerve. So it is the greater palatine nerve that gives off the posterior inferior lateral nasal branch to supply the posterior inferior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So it's good for us to be able to establish this in case we're asked during examination. So I haven't talked about the lateral wall. We've talked about the superior part and the inferior part, which is on the lateral wall. So going to the nasal septum of this region, what are the nerves that are seen to innervate the nasal septum at the posterior part of the nasal septum, both the upper part and the lower part? So for the upper part, it is innervated by the posterior superior medial nasal nerve. And this is the posterior superior medial nasal nerve here that emerges from the nasal branches of the ganglion. And you see it emerging, passing through the posterior superior upper part of the nasal septum. and that is where it innervates. And this will innervate the posterior upper nasal septum. Then the last region will now be the posterior lower nasal septum. And this will be innervated from also the nasal branches. Remember, we talked about the posterior superior medial nasal nerve that is innervating the posterior superior part of the nasal septum. If you look at the collection of this nerve, because these nerves emerging from the pterygopalatine ganglion are not just one nerve, but are represented with a single line just for neatness. So they're actually collections of nerves or groups of nerves. The largest of this nerve will then be driven and directed towards the inferior part of the nasal septum. And this is what is referred to as the nasopalatine nerve. This nasopalatine nerve is what is then seen to innervate the posterior inferior part of the nasal septum. So going through the name, because it's medial, the medial refers to the nasal septum because it's located along the medial plane. Because this forms the medial wall of the nasal cavity. This is where we have the nasal cavity, and the medial wall of the nasal cavity is formed by the nasal septum. And that is why you see the name medial. So anywhere you see medial, you should know that it is the nasal septum, because the nasal septum is located along the medial wall of the nasal cavity. So when you see medial within the name, you should know that it is innervating the nasal septum. So the posterior superior medial nasal nerve to innervate the posterior superior part of the nasal septum, which is the upper region. So the lower region will also be innervated by branches from the posterior superior medial nasal nerve. But it's going to be the largest of this group of nerve that will be collected and directed towards the lower part or the inferior part of the nasal septum, of course, at the posterior region. So this is how the innervation of the nasal septum is also being established. So you see that we've taken the lateral wall and also the nasal septum side by side, also establishing the different branches that are seen to innervate the specific regions. This slide is like a summary slide that will be used to establish the different innervations of the different sub-regions of the nasal cavity. We are going to be dividing the nasal cavity into 4 quadrants. We have the anterior upper quadrant, the anterior lower quadrant, we have the posterior upper quadrant, we have the posterior lower quadrant. So for the anterior upper quadrant, for the lateral wall is what we are establishing with this slide. The lateral wall will be innervated by the anterior ethmoidal nerve. And we know that the anterior ethmoidal nerve is a branch of the maxillary nerve, which of course branches from the ophthalmic, and we know the ophthalmic is a branch of the trigeminal. So it's good for us to be able to trace it back. And this is what innervates the superior upper quadrant. That's the lateral wall of the superior upper quadrant of the nasal cavity. So the anterior lower quadrant will be innervated, that is of the lateral wall. We'll still be going to the nasal septum in our next slide, but for this slide is the lateral wall. So the anterior lower quadrant of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity will be innervated by the anterior superior alveolar nerve. The anterior superior alveolar nerve is a branch of the infraorbital nerve, which of course branches from the maxillary nerve. And of course, the maxillary nerve is a branch of the trigeminal nerve. So these are the branches that innervate the anterior region of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, both the upper and the lower part. We already said the upper part is from branches from the ophthalmic, while the lower is the branches from the maxillary nerve. So going to the posterior upper quadrant here, that is already in purple, the posterior upper quadrant will be innervated by the posterior superior lateral nasal nerve. The posterior superior lateral nasal nerve is a branch of the Pterygopalatine ganglion. We've already stated this in our previous slide, that it's one of the nasal branches from the Pterygopalatine ganglion, while the posterior lower quadrant, which is already in green, will be innervated by the posterior inferior lateral nasal nerve. Posterior inferior, it means it's innervating the posterior part, but the inferior lateral means lateral wall nasal nerve. So you should be able to establish where this nerve specifically innervates, maybe breaking down or looking deep onto the words. Then also to add that the posterior inferior lateral nasal nerve is branched from the greater palatine nerve. And the greater palatine nerve, which is also a branch of the pterygopalatine ganglion. So you see that the greater palatine nerve will first emerge from the pterygopalatine ganglion before giving off branches as the posterior inferior lateral nasal nerve that will then be seen to innervate the posterior inferior part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So that's how it goes, and it's good for us to be able to establish this. And the greater palatine nerve can also be referred to as the anterior palatine nerve. Then going to the summary area of the nasal septum, also dividing it into 4 quadrants. The anterior upper quadrant here, that is harrowed here in blue, will be innervated by the anterior ethmoidal nerve. The anterior ethmoidal nerve, we already know that is branched from the maxillary, which of course is a branch of the ophthalmic. Then the anterior inferior part of the nasal septum will be innervated by the anterior superior alveolar nerve, which branches from the infraorbital, which of course is a branch of the maxillary nerve. So you can see that the anterior region of the nasal cavity, both the lateral wall and also the nasal septum, are supplied by branches from the same nerve. If you look at the previous slide, where we try to highlight the innervations of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, the anterior quadrant, which includes the anterior upper and the anterior lower quadrant, are being supplied by the same nerve with the nasal septum as presented on this slide. So they are innervated by the same nerves, both the lateral wall and also the nasal septum of this region. So going to the posterior part that is harrowed here in purple, the posterior upper part of the nasal septum is innervated by the posterior superior medial nasal nerve. We already said that mere looking at the name should know the specific region that it innervates. The posterior part, the superior part, the medial, because it's the nasal septum. So the posterior superior medial nasal nerve will be innervating the posterior superior part of the nasal septum. Branches from the Pterygopalatine ganglion. And this we've highlighted in our previous slide. Then the posterior inferior part of the nasal septum will be innervated by the nasopalatine nerve. We already said that the nasopalatine nerve is the largest branch of the posterior superior medial nasal nerve. So if you see a collection of the posterior superior medial nasal nerve, the largest of those branches will be driven down to supply the posterior lower part of the nasal septum. It still branches from the nasal branches of the Pterygopalatine ganglion, and this is seen to pass through the sphenopalatine foramen before it's able to innervate the nasal septum in this region. So this is how the different regions in terms of the lateral wall and also the nasal septum of the nasal cavity are innervated by different nerves. So let's check our understanding of this lecture through the following question. And the first one is to describe the special sensory innervation of the nasal cavity. We already established that there is a special sensory innervation of the nasal cavity, which is the sense of smell, and this is specifically carried by a specific type of nerve. Then the second question is to state the nerves that innervate the 4 quadrants of the lateral nasal wall and also the nasal septum. The third question is to list the branches from the Pterygopalatine ganglion that innervate the nasal cavity. We already established this also during the course of this lecture, that we have a number of branches from the Pterygopalatine ganglion, but it is just the nasal and also the palatine branches that are involved in innervating the nasal cavity. So it's good for us to be able to list these branches. So thanks for watching this video. Let's meet again.